Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I'm your host, Steve Halley. With me, as per usual, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, how the heck are you this week?
I'm all right, man. The leaves are changing. So, as they would say in Game of Thrones, winter is coming.
Winter is coming. Yes, in lovely New England, Western Mass. I spent some time in New England,
I'm
and
sorry.
where I spent time in New England, Hanover, New Hampshire, they would have buses full of old people come and like drive around, get out of the bus and like look at the changing leaves and then get back on the bus.
I like it's called leaf peeping, I think.
Leaf peeping. Yeah. And
Not for me.
I'm going to need a couple more decades under my belt before I'm like, oh, that sounds amazing.
I don't think I'm going to get there even with a few more decades. What, by the way, is like the joke about Dartmouth. There's all the how many fill in your favorite college students does it take to screw in a light bulb? The Dart was 0. They don't have electricity in Hanover.
That's right. Yeah,
It's
no, we use like whale fat, whale blubber out of Portsmouth. It's rustic. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
But
by the
you're
way, I live in
Williams.
Western Massachusetts, so
Yeah,
yeah.
you're Williams. You don't have a leg to stand on. Anyway, quick piece of housekeeping before we get started today. I always forget to tell people to like and subscribe and share. We're on Substack. We're on YouTube. Tell your friend, tell your neighbors, even if you think we suck, just be like, hey, check these idiots out. Like, aren't they ridiculous? It'll help us grow. And I don't know, bring our unique style of thinking to more people. But that's always fun, right, Galen?
Yeah, and I'd prefer that, people not get the word out if we suck. But
Spoken like a true academic.
I guess I'll defer to you on marketing.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Now that that's under control, out of the way, this week we're doing book club as our entire episode. What we did last week with Professor Green, we didn't read an article though. We actually read a book this week. And Galen, you want to maybe set the table for us? Yeah, you have the physical book. I always do it on Kindle. So what is this? What are we looking at?
This is The Eurasian Century by Hal Brands. So hot off the press, just published. I don't know. I just got my copy a couple days ago, which, by the way, I'm glad to say I've still got the grad student gear. I was able to read it in about a day.
Not bad.
So,
It could be
that's
5
nice.
days. Yeah.
Yeah, which also is not bad. In part, we'll sort of get into what we thought about the substance of it, but I think we both enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, it's a good book. And Professor Brands is at Johns Hopkins SICE. What does SICE stand for? I always
School of Advanced International Study, I think.
Thank you.
Paul Mitz's school.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, they have an academic program, a very good one, but is really a policy school. And the policy that they look at more than anything is national security and national security strategy, right, Galen? So that's what Brands does.
Yeah, and he's been writing on grand strategy for a long time. By the way, I've written a book. It was not easy. I'm glad I did it. Proud of the work I did on it, but there were moments it was soul crushing. This is I don't know, this is like his 10th book or something, in addition to being a columnist at Bloomberg. He gets out, he's prolific to a degree that I frankly can't even fathom, even if I were teaching and had, endless research funds. Well, I once asked him about that, and basically, he said a few things, but one of them was it has to be a daily habit. You
Produce.
like you do anything else as a matter of a daily practice. And so I think he writes every day, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I know him best from his work at Bloomberg. He's an opinion columnist there, and I've liked his stuff a lot. I enjoyed reading the book. It's a good read. In terms of what it has to say, there's a lot in there. I would not qualify it necessarily as like a hardcore scholarly book of the type you would write to get tenure at Johns Hopkins or Williams for that matter. It's not that type of book. It's a little bit more popular in nature. And we were talking for the episode, Gail, and you said that it's really oriented towards promoting a certain policy for the United States. And we'll unpack that. But first, do you want to kind of discuss what the book is about and what Brands is saying?
I think so it's sort of oriented around influential thinkers, both appreciated and maybe underappreciated in their time, both at the turn of the 20th century and then sort of around World War II, who made the claim that the key to geopolitics and international security and stability was the Eurasian continent. So
Hmm.
I think the guy he spends probably the most time talking about is Harold Mackinder, who's a British intellectual and policymaker.
Was
Um,
it Halford Mackinder?
oh, is it Halford Mackinder?
I
Uh,
think it's Halford, which is one
okay.
of those names that's like, okay, Halford. Yeah.
I
Anyway,
probably did
Mackinder.
the thing where, I looked at it and registered it a different way.
Exactly. Don't know too many Halfords out there.
Yeah. So he's probably the main one that I think he's interested in. Alfred Thayer Mahan, who, if you've taken American Grand Strategy, you probably know about. The intellectual forefather to the idea that the key to, international politics is who controls the seas.
Hmm.
So influential guy at the Naval War College, which was set up at the end of the 19th century, I think. And then the other guy he talks about somewhat is Nicholas Spike. Is it Spikeman or Spickman?
You told me Spikeman the other day. I don't actually know.
Okay, I think it's Spikeman. I've seen it referenced before, but never in as much detail. Anyway, like he orients the book kind of around this mode of thought, which I think the part of the book you and I largely agree with, or I guess I'll let you share your own thoughts. But the one of the guiding principles of American Grand Strategy for many years has been the idea that you cannot allow the formation of a Eurasian hegemon or a
Hmm.
block of countries that works together to dominate Eurasia. Now, in sort of the most straightforward form, the argument would be if a country is able to establish total predominance or preponderance on Eurasia, it can then mobilize those resources and ultimately pose a direct threat to the United States in the Western Hemisphere. Sort of a lesser version of this argument is they'll be able to sort of close off open world commerce, and this will have all sorts of effects on international economics, and maybe life won't be as good in the United States. And then another concern you see maybe even more frequently, even if it doesn't involve the conquering of the United States directly, is the idea that to defend itself in such a world, the United States would have to put itself on a permanent war and military footing, which could lead to the rise of what's known as the garrison state. And so the US way of life and democratic values and the US political system will be at stake, even if the country isn't necessarily taken over. So that's kind of his starting point for the.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. To the garrison state point, it's this idea of losing what you are trying to defend by trying to defend it. And yeah, it's these geopolitical theorists that you mentioned all agreed effectively that what you don't want is somebody taking over East Asia and Europe, the two sort of poles that have a lot of people and industrial power at either end of the larger continent of Eurasia. The fourth thinker that he talks about a lot is George Kennan when we get
Correct.
to the Cold War. And the book is basically a series of case studies, three big ones. You may have heard of them: World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. So we
Yes.
have two hot wars and a Cold War, which I think Brands rightly identifies as kind of warm, actually. There were a lot of there's a lot of peripheral violence during the Cold War in Korea and Vietnam in particular, but elsewhere as well.
Yeah,
But
even aside stuff like the Cultural Revolution in China, like
yeah,
purely violence perpetrated against one's own citizens by the state, I think the number is roughly 20 million people die in these small hot wars that took place during the Cold War.
right. Anyway, we have these series of effectively world wars, because you could call the Cold War World War III if you wanted to. Some people do that. I'm not one of them, but it was a gigantic confrontation over the course of, 4 to 5 decades. And you have these aspiring Eurasian hegemons, Germany twice, and the second time, Japan was also involved in a big way. And then the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, all of which were authoritarian I think World War I, it's a little bit early to call Germany totalitarian, but certainly in World War II and the Cold War, you were fighting totalitarian states. And these guys were nasty bastards. And if they had won, the world would look different and probably not very good for the average human being on planet Earth. And so the argument is, it is good that the United States went out of its way eventually to stop this from happening, right, Galen? And World War I and World War II, it took a minute because we didn't want to. Cold War, we started out on the front foot. So that was a slightly different case. And it could be argued, I think Brands argues this more or less implicitly, that if we had not done that, if we had not started out on the front foot with the containment strategy, then we would have had a hot World War III.
Yeah, if it's not explicit, it's about as implicit before getting to explicit as one gets. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So the arguments are geopolitical theorists saying, do not let any single power or combination or, alliance conquer Eurasia, number one. Number two, that almost happened 3 times in the course of a single century, the Eurasian century. We stopped it. The United States and its allies stopped it. It wasn't easy. A bunch of people died.
A big point for him is it didn't have to turn out that way.
No, it was contingent. And I agree with that. World War I, World War II, you look at the numbers, the raw numbers behind it, and you're like, oh, okay, like the Allies were large and in charge. It was never going to be a thing that the Axis or the Central Powers could win. And he's like, no, I mean, they actually could have. And I think that's true. I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, we'll get to that. I do broadly agree. I think World War I is an easier case to make.
I do too.
But even World War II, a book I believe he cites several times, because I was looking through the citations as I went, was Richard Overy's Why the Allies Won, which is up as...
That's a classic.
I agree, an outstanding book. And the whole argument is it was definitely not preordained that the Allies, just because of their economic and military advantages, necessarily were going to win.
Mm-hmm.
But, we can talk in more detail about it. There's 2 other points I want to raise. One, a major theme for him, this does kind of have a vibe of good and evil. And look, it's hard to argue when it comes to states like Soviet Russia under Stalin and Nazi Germany under Hitler. But there's a major theme that's threaded through all of these cases about basically autocracies are bad states and you can't do business with them because they're intent on revisionism and so forth. So we can talk about that. And the other thing is, I think the book, I've asked him about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's motivated, at least in part and perhaps in great part, by what he sees today as the troubling rise of China and its loose alignment with Russia, which we've spoken about. He co-authored a book a few years ago with Michael Beckley called Danger Zone. He argued that when you get problems in international politics is when you have not necessarily rising powers, which is how I've typically studied it, that want to challenge the system, but peaking powers that aren't necessarily going to overtake the prevailing hegemon or disrupt the international hierarchy, but are going to see a time when the gap is closed or narrowed, and that might be the time to challenge the existing order. And their argument is China is a revisionist actor. Over the long term, it's got a bunch of problems, but in kind of the short to medium term, it has to be confronted, a la, the Truman administration right after World War II. And I don't think it's a surprise then that he labels the Cold War period. That chapter, I think, is called The Golden Age. So he's very much invoking that when addressing
that idea.
The
I
challenge.
think that idea, yeah. For what it's worth, I think that idea is only half right. I think, it is certainly possible to get problems when you have a peaking power coming from below. It is also possible when you have a power that is not peaking, it's going to overtake the hegemon, the number one power, and the number one power doesn't like it.
That's the Thucydides trap, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's this idea of somebody is in charge and has been in charge for a long time, but that just never stays the same forever because history doesn't stop and like things happen inside of and between countries. Not necessarily at random, but you have these long-term complex processes that result in decline and the rise of countries, right? And there's a number one and a clear number two. Very often it is the case that you're going to have issues between them in one form or another. We've seen that historically. That's
Now,
not a controversial idea.
I don't think, I have no idea, but I suspect he doesn't disagree with that either. It's just to say that his work on China is that they are peaking, not rising. But the book's called Danger Zone because there's this period during which you're going to have to deal with them at the height of their power. And the name of the game is getting through that without having World War III.
Yeah. I think we both think that this book is a pretty good read for like a general audience. If you're into 20th century history and geopolitics and military stuff, I think it's engaging and very, very interesting. Like it was a good refresher for me on a lot of this stuff.
And I think it will, at the very least, for someone who's like just getting into this stuff, like I suspect it's, as you said, engaging enough. It might get more people involved in the study of grand strategy. The other thing that's like that stems from this is it does have the flavor of someone like Robert Kagan, right, who wrote a book called Jungle Grows Back. Like the whole argument is you basically need the United States engaged in the world because otherwise things are going to go to shit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's like principally the policy implication here is like, now is not the time to be drawing back. Now is the time to actually be confronting these challenges. And if the U.S. doesn't do it, it's uniquely situated because of its geographic position, its system of government, and a bunch of other reasons. It's kind of the only country that can do it.
Okay. Let's use this as a springboard then into the sort of contemporary part of the book, which is the fourth potential conflict in the 21st century. Brands makes the argument that if the 20th century was a Eurasian century, we had these three gigantic Eurasian conflicts, right, between the United States and various combinations of autocracies. The 21st century is also going to be a Eurasian century. The second Eurasian century, we're going to do it again. And this time we're going to do it with China, right? And this podcast is called Global Tantrum for a reason. It is the case that in 2025, we are seeing the United States change its national security strategy. I don't think there's any questions about that at this stage of the game, right, Galen? We talked about it extensively. And things are changing around the United States as a result of that. And even before we made those changes, right? You can argue about causality, but to some extent, there is a global tantrum. To some extent, the jumbo is growing back. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess the question I have, talking specifically about some of the evidence in the book, is the degree to which that is the result of revisionist actors and the result of like U.S. own goals. And
I would agree. Yeah.
And I think the answer to some degree is both. I should say, like, I'm not an expert on China, but I do think that you should believe statements, and Xi Jinping has made a number of them, that indicate that China has fairly expansive objectives. Now, there's a debate about whether it's capable of achieving those objectives. Another question I had reading this book was, how plausible was it that any of these countries, even the real bad guys, were capable of achieving total hegemony on the Eurasian continents? I have, frankly, some doubts about that. The other piece here is, and again, you can see how one gets here. If you're writing about Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, it's easy to say, hey, yes, there are good states and bad states. My own view is I'm not quite as skeptical about the ability of states of differing political systems to reach political accommodations. I think I have seen it before. Whether that's possible today, I'm not in a position to say, but ruling it out as a matter of principle guarantees that you cannot reach an accommodation with one's adversary. And, some of the cases I just was not as persuaded. So World War One, for example, yes, the Germans do some bad stuff. Everyone's using poison gas. I
You
don't.
want to talk about bad stuff? What about like the British in India? Right.
So
Not
right.
a lot
So
of fun there.
this is my now. Like there are some people who actually describe the German system pre World War One as relatively democratic because it had an elected parliament. Now, national security decisions were not vested with that body, but you can make a case that it was roughly as democratic as some of the other states, or at least I've heard people make that argument. I guess like the other problem I have with that is he very much pins the blame for the war entirely on the Germans. Having looked at some of those documents myself, Fritz Fischer famously promoted this argument back in the 60s. Like, I teach a whole class session where we go through his own evidence, where he's like, yeah, they weren't interested in localizing the war. You look at one of the documents. In fact, I have it pulled up right now. It literally is from German foreign affairs official. We must attempt to localize the conflict, right? Like, so I don't buy that as much. You brought up British and French colonialism.
No fun. Also, Tsarist Russia in the first part of the
Right.
world.
So, like,
That was certainly the worst autocracy of the bunch.
yeah,
Right?
like, I don't think that works as well. The other thing was he kind of has a different take on the Treaty of Versailles, where the conventional wisdom is it was a punitive treaty that basically meant that the Germans were inevitably going to challenge it. I personally don't think we need to revise that conventional wisdom. Like, just looking at a document of Nixon and Kissinger talking, uh, where Nixon says it was too tough. Kissinger says it humiliated Germany without weakening it. It put all the weight on France and Russia fell out, a disaster. My own view is like, that's basically right. The Germans call it the slave treaty. And in terms of the causes of the war, it's not like the states on the Allied side have clean hands. You mentioned Russia's an autocracy. It's stirring things up in the Balkans in a way that's inevitably going to impact German interests. The French are supporting it. It's not to say the Germans didn't make mistakes. I think them building a fleet was inevitably going to bring them in conflict with the British, so that was dumb. But the point is, I viewed World War One as a largely political conflict that is less about, competing political systems or the Germans trying to take over the world.
So let's talk a little bit like fast forwarding past World War II, which I think is a lot more clear cut. Yeah, in terms of like good versus evil, quote unquote.
I had some like things on the margins. Like, I kind of think once the Germans don't get to Moscow in 41, the game is, if not over, like, you can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel because the Germans can't wage a long war. But I agree, that case is more clear cut.
Yeah, the Cold War case I think is interesting. And I want to bring up a point you made a little bit earlier, which is whether it's even possible for a coalition to take over the entirety of Eurasia, especially once nuclear weapons are involved, right? And that's going to play a role, obviously, in the fourth, potential conflict, a big role, I would imagine, particularly if we see more proliferation. So, and during the Cold War, by the way, the United States leaned very heavily on nuclear weapons to deter Russia as part of the strategy of containment. So it's interesting that like he kind of like glides past this, it's like, well, like this could have happened in the Cold War and we needed to stop it from happening. And we almost ran into a nuclear war, by the way, a number of times in the Cold War. And
by the way, I liked that part of the book. I liked not just the stuff on the Korean War, but like, the stuff on the Berlin crises. Like, these were real crises where you did need to show resolve, and like, it's not preordained that the U.S. largely prevails in some of these crises, or at least affects these thrusts.
You have these nuclear crises, right? But they are not necessarily over core interests, like the sovereignty of a nuclear state, right? Let's suppose that Russia had successfully coerced itself all the way to France during the Cold War, right? France would probably launch, to stop the fall of France. And so I think that's kind of the crux of the argument to
Yeah,
me.
there's also the argument that it's not clear that the Soviets were interested in conquering Western Europe, right? Like,
That's true.
like this is one of the arguments that one of our mentors, Mark Trachtenberg, makes. Like, once you kind of figure out the German problem, Europe is largely stable for the rest of the Cold War, and the most dangerous part of it is over because there's a
And
settlement that everyone can live with.
if I'm remembering correctly, Brands also like alludes to that. I think during D'Antan in particular, like the Soviets are actually happy that the Americans are in Europe and the system is stable and like NATO is there. And
I think he says that about the very end of the Cold War.
okay, all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No,
maybe
I mean,
not the 70s.
that was another historical part of the book that I kind of did. My book is all about how it's actually the Soviets that take détente seriously, and we're the ones that are trying to exploit it for unilateral gain.
Right.
So, again, bearing on this whole question of can you work with your adversary if they're not a democracy? My answer is, my own view is sometimes you can.
Yeah, we
Um,
do it all the time in some issue areas.
Yeah. And I'm not putting these on in equal footing by any means, but I think the book's a bit too rosy about what happens within the US. He mentions some of these things, but the corrosive effects of these wars internally. He doesn't say much about the erosion of civil liberties during World War I and things like the Espionage Act, which are still around, by the way. I think he does mention the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, but and as far as war fighting itself goes, the United States firebombs a huge number of Japanese cities prior to dropping the atomic bombs. So I don't think anyone is fighting these things in a clean way, so to speak.
Totally. Okay. Should we move to sort of the fourth conflict and the 21st century?
Can I make
As
one more point on the book?
yeah,
That it struck me aside from those things, which maybe are important, but maybe I didn't think the post Cold War US foreign policy stuff was as persuasive. I think the US made a ton of mistakes. I think there's one page dedicated to the post 9/11 errors. I suspect I just disagree with him on certain aspects of US policy post Cold War, but to me, it's like 1991. Everyone's talking about the United States is suddenly this overwhelming superpower that's just
yeah,
unrivaled in the history of world politics. And here we are, a generation and a half later, and things look pretty bad. I think there were some serious mistakes made.
mistakes were made. Yeah,
Yes.
no, 1,000%. And I think that Brands kind of fast forwards through that stuff because he wants to get to the main event.
Yeah, which we should now do. So
Yeah, which is Cold War II against China. We've identified Brands as somebody who wants to fight a Cold War and contain China. And he wants to stop China from taking Taiwan in particular. And we were talking before the show, I have a framework for thinking about this stuff in the 21st century, vis-a-vis a rising China versus the United States. And we've talked about various pieces of this in previous shows, including Taiwan. But I think about it as like a 2x3 grid. And the 2 part of the grid is whether you believe that China is a revisionist state, so wants to take over the top role from the United States in the 21st century, or a status quo state, whether it's actually not trying to do that and its aims are limited. So that's kind of one dimension. And then the other dimension is what the United States should do about that. And there are 3 basic options there. One option is primacy, right? So that's all the way forward, basically stop China from taking Taiwan at all costs and contain China and fight the Cold War, right? 2 is selective engagement. So maybe trade Taiwan away, reach some sort of a accommodation with China and achieve a stable configuration, so détente during the Cold War. 3 is restraints or neo-isolationism. There are different flavors of this, but it's like, we don't care what happens in Eurasia. And we actually reject this argument. And we can hang out in the Western Hemisphere and just take over the Western Hemisphere and run it and let the Russians, the Chinese do their thing in Eurasia, and we'll be fine. And in fact, the world will be more stable this way.
Which I think if he is confronting any argument, it's that one, right? Like
Yes.
the idea that the rest of the world can't touch us. I think that's his now, like, by the way, you can agree with that and not go where he goes. You were telling me it's not out yet, but that there's word on what the Trump administration's new national security strategy might say. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about Elbridge Colby on this show being, I think, the main author. Like his group is writing this at the moment. And
Was one of the main people that did the one during the first term. So yeah.
yes, in 2018. And that one was pretty much a straightforward, shift your attention to Asia, get out of Europe, get out of the Middle East, contain China, as I understood it, disallow China from taking Taiwan, and fight another Cold War. From what we are hearing, we'll know more soon, but from the reporting we've seen, the second one is actually much more concentrate on the Western Hemisphere and concentrate on the homeland, right? Which is much more of like a neo-isolationist argument. And it's a round rejection of Mackinder and Spikeman and all of these guys from the 20th century saying like, no, you cannot allow anybody to take over Eurasia or assume dominance of Eurasia. This is much more like, actually, we can, and we'll be fine, and we can hang out in the Western Hemisphere and run that. I think many of the second Trump administration's early foreign policy moves around the Greenland stuff, around Panama, around Venezuela, which we've talked about, big tariffs on Brazil, confrontation with Canada, are consistent with this third view, right, Galen? And the biggest problem of the book, in my opinion, is that Brands wrote it before Trump was reelected.
Well, hey, maybe that's a feature, not a bug for him.
Could be. Yeah.
Now he has a policy audience that he's addressing head on. This is not a new mode of thinking.
Not at all.
Strategy.
It's an old mode of thinking.
Yes. Now, like we laid out the logic earlier. I assigned this book in one of my classes by Michael Lind, The American Way of Strategy, where he makes this case like, look, if you're the United States, you've got to have an open international economic system. You got to prevent the rise of a regional hegemon that can threaten you elsewhere. There's all these concerns about the garrison state. That's one perspective. Another perspective is we live in the Western Hemisphere. We've got weak and until relatively recently, mostly friendly neighbors to the north and south, and fish to the east and west. The U.S. crosses an entire continent, so it has plenty of resources. Like we can afford to not care as much about what goes on elsewhere and focus on what's called hemispheric defense, right? Like this was a big debate prior to U.S. intervention in World War II. I went with Mark Stoller, the eminent historian of U.S. strategy during World War II. You want to read an awesome World War II book, Allies and Adversaries. And I think it's like the first chapter of that book. He talks about there's this debate. Like if we're sending Lend-Lease aid, which the Roosevelt administration decides to do to bolster the Soviets and the British, there's going to be hell to pay if they're knocked out of the war and the Germans turn toward us and we no longer have that equipment. I think there's a line in there about like, we'll be hung from a sour apple tree or something. And obviously there's isolationist sentiment that FDR has to confront during that period.
Lindbergh.
This is not a new mode of thinking, but it is kind of the antithesis of what Brands is writing about in this book.
It's not. And by the way, Spikeman became famous for disabusing the foreign policy establishment of this notion that hemispheric defense would work in World War II. What he said was, look, if the Nazis conquer Europe and the Japanese conquer Asia, we're actually going to be vulnerable in the Western Hemisphere because they can establish bases at the southern tip of South America and our bombers can't reach them. That's no longer necessarily the case in the 21st century. Technology has improved. But at that time, like that was a very important sort of technical addendum to what forward containment strategy, I guess you could say. And I also want to draw a parallel between America First in the 1930s and America First in the 2020s, right? It's the same slogan. The ideas have changed somewhat for sure, but it's kind of consistent.
Yeah. And like, you have to wonder if the geographic argument stopped holding in a world of ICBMs. I don't think that just eliminates, I actually think that's one strength of the book is, geography is really important and it's immutable.
Yep.
So it's something you kind of have to care about. But it is interesting. And again, that strategy has not been published yet, that it appears that might be the direction the administration's going. Now, like,
when it is published, we'll analyze it, right? We should do a show on that for sure.
yeah. Well, so look, I'm not a China specialist, as I said, but like now, like we can debate how expansive their objectives are. I'm generally persuaded that they're a revisionist actor. Brands describes it in pretty dire terms, how expansive their objectives are. I frankly don't know how expansive they are. And if this means, like China wants the whole Pacific Ocean all the way up to Hawaii, I think, as he insinuates at one point. But
yeah,
I think it's fair to say they're a revisionist actor. And so the question becomes, what do you do about that? And
yeah, I think we should quickly note that not everybody agrees with that point of view.
Of course.
Yeah. And there was an article in Foreign Affairs recently by a group of China experts called What China Wants, basically pushing back against this and going into the documentary evidence, because there's a ton of evidence coming out of China, both pro and con, this point of view, making the argument that like, no, China's aims are actually limited. What it means by control of Taiwan is not necessarily fighting a war over Taiwan. It's ensuring that Taiwan doesn't achieve independence, right? And that's that's been argued over for a very long time.
Yeah.
And actually, these guys are not looking to take over the international system. They just want to change some of the rules that they see as unfair. And they want to continue with the stuff the US has set up on a more even footing. So that's the counter argument. I personally don't buy it. It sounds like you don't buy it either. I don't buy it because I'm not a China expert, but I've seen this movie a number of times. And I know how it tends to turn out. I know how rising states like China tend to behave. If they have an opportunity to take over, they will take it sooner or later.
Yeah,
I think it's that simple.
Look, China's premier, I think it was yesterday, had some private meeting with some US academics and businesses basically saying the key here is like we're a married couple and married couples have tensions and bicker, but like we don't want a divorce, i.e. a war.
Right.
And like, I couldn't tell you whether to take that at face value. Like,
this is probably a moving target, right?
Here's the part of Brands' book that I am not persuaded by. I've already said it, but since we're at this point, we might as well like hash it out, right? Like, he spends some time talking about how bad these guys are. Like, you can do it in some cases pretty easily. I do think like, there's legitimate criticisms of things the United States has done in the Cold War and since, right? Like, so I don't think the United States has a monopoly on virtue. To be clear, he doesn't put it like that, but I do think it's couched in quite there's good states and bad states kind of language. The part I'm not persuaded by is that it is simply impossible for the United States to do business with a power like China because of the nature of its political system. I do think it is possible to relate to them on a business-like basis, assuming they are willing. And like, I make no claim as to know whether they are willing or not.
It depends on the sphere, right? It depends on, it
depends on a bunch of things by his own, to use his own argument, like it's contingent. Xi Jinping is governing in a way that is different from Hu Jintao, which was different from Jiang Zemin, which was different from Deng Xiaoping, right? Like, but the very fact, as we've covered on this show, that China was aligned with the Soviets against the Americans, then with the Americans against the Soviets, and now with the Russians against the Americans, means like these things shift. There are certain political interests they value very highly, which they might value so highly that you could cut deals with them on certain things. We
Mhm.
went to specifics here, but um, positing that you cannot work with a country like China for domestic political reasons basically means there's no chance to do so. And it might be worth checking that out. And we have seen successful examples of this in the past. And given that none of us want World War III, I think it's worth investigating those.
Yeah, and I think the United States is currently investigating those. The Trump administration has raised tariffs on China and continued policies like export controls of advanced technologies to China. There's two ways to interpret that. One way to interpret it is we are trying to contain China and stop China's rise, and they need this stuff from us to continue to do it. And we won't give it to them under any circumstances. The other way to interpret it is these are bargaining chips. And if we can secure a deal with China, then where we get some of what we want and they get some of what they want, then we can take that deal and make war less likely, basically. And I think the jury's kind of out on what the objective is and then what's actually going to happen, right? If you listen to what Trump says, all he talks about is making deals. Literally all he talks about, right? It's like he wants a deal here, he wants a deal there, he wants a deal with Putin, he wants a deal with Xi Jinping. We know that. He wants to deal with Europe. Like he wants to deal with everybody. But it's like, well, what does that actually mean? Right? Is that a deal on the United States' terms or is it a 50-50 deal? We don't know. And we don't know how these other countries think or feel about what's on offer. Like, I think it's just too early to say. Right? But he is out there seemingly attempting to negotiate, is what I would say. And the results remain to be seen.
Yeah. And we've talked about this, how he has dealt with Putin, although he seems to have done a real reversal on that in recent days.
Who knows? Who knows, right? Another way of interpreting what's happened in recent days is he's saying, just to quickly set the table, Ukraine can win the war with European help, and NATO should shoot down Russian incursions into its airspace.
Well, and Ukraine should reclaim all of its territory.
Yeah, and it can with European help. And there's two ways to look at that. One is, okay, green light. Like, let's win this war. You guys, should win. The other way to look at it is green light, but we're not going to help you.
Yeah.
We're done.
Maybe it could also be viewed as a bargaining move, right? Hey, Vladimir, I offered you this deal, which most people gave me shit for because it was too favorable to you and comes at Ukraine's expense. You said no, like that was the carrot. Now you get the stick.
Like we're going to let this process play out. And in fact, I've been reading about how Ukraine has been making some gains recently, more or less under its own power, which is pretty interesting, using all that drone stuff we've talked about. So
the other piece of the book that's directly relevant to this grand strategy debate today, and there are obvious downsides to doing hemispheric defense if in fact that turns out to be what the new strategy calls for. One thing it does guard against is overextension. And I, for one, have been worried about U.S. overextension for some time. You're reading the book, especially when you get toward the end and the situation that confronts the United States today. And I was surprised the Middle East makes an appearance in that part. And, there's a reasonable question as to what is a vital U.S. interest and what is not. At a certain point, one of the things that's interesting about the book, especially when he's talking about the world wars, is just the unbelievable spatial dimensions and the unreal amounts of weaponry that gets produced and the huge mobilization. The statistics are just so astronomical. They're almost
the deaths. Don't forget the deaths.
Of course. All this stuff is just mind blowing. That's in the context of a world war, which we're hoping to prevent. If you take as expansive a view of U.S. global interests as Brands does, I do think you have to worry about overextension.
Yeah. And to your point, it's one way to look at the 21st century vis-a-vis U.S. grand strategy and foreign policy is we got overextended. And now everything we're seeing, starting with the Trump presidency and following, is a response to imperial overextension, right?
again, like this is why this stuff about the interaction between fighting wars and what happens at home, I think deserves a lot of attention. Like war can be very corrosive to
Absolutely.
political consensus at home. And I think we have seen a real backlash against that.
Yeah.
Uh,
You can argue, the first Trump, I think I've said this on the show, the first Trump administration is a democratic response in part to a lot of those failures, right?
I think Randy Schweller had like a thing about this back during Trump's term, that this was like a second image reversed argument, that like
Mhm.
this was basically the result of post Cold War blunders.
Yeah,
I did
failure.
want to ask you, we alluded to it earlier, but like for this argument to hold, and again, I am persuaded by the logic that like a Eurasian hegemon or a hostile block of powers that dominates all of Eurasia would be really bad news.
Mhm.
Do you think it is possible for such a hegemon or a block of countries to emerge in this day and age?
It's hard to say because the wild card is like these new technologies
Yeah.
that are coming out of the woodwork in terms of AI and autonomous systems and drones and so on, laser weapons. Like, we just don't know what this stuff is going to do, whether it privileges the offense or the defense. It's being played out right now. My sort of baseline on that question is no. I think that if we adopt a hemispheric defense stance and go to like great power concert system or something like that, where we make accommodations with Russia and China, one pretty immediate result of that is all of our allies get nuclear weapons, right? So that's something that we have to think about.
Well, that's certainly a possibility, dude.
Yeah, yeah. And like that could happen in relatively short order, honestly. I have thought about the Ukrainians getting nuclear weapons and that being a huge danger. It's one thing if like the Poles do it or the Japanese, they're not in an active war, right?
Like, to be clear, those would not be open and shut peaceful cases either, but
No, but like there's levels, right? Russia obviously doesn't want any of that to happen, and neither does China, but they would have to go to war to stop it.
Yeah.
They'd have to go with war with NATO and war with Japan, these are not trivial prospects in any way, shape, or form, right? With Ukraine, if things start to go badly for Ukraine, like worse than they already have been, there is a world in which they have a crash nuclear program. And that's pretty fucking dangerous. If you ask me.
and as you said, like assuming it got detected, which, is not a slam dunk,
Not at all.
that would be a very ripe target for Russian preventive military action. But like, I guess the reason I'm asking you this, and I basically agree. And again, if I'm pointing to a strong point of the book, I do like that he says this stuff is contingent.
Mhm.
I do like that he says like nothing was guaranteed. I think it's like there are parts of it where I think it's a bit overstated, but if you look at how things looked at the time, it didn't seem that way. Like the Soviets being on the march in the 1970s, right? That was kind of the perception, when in reality, it was like their last step before terminal decline into collapse.
You never know, right?
Right? Like, but the people didn't know it at the time. I'm just saying, like, that seems somewhat overstated. But like, the reason I'm harping on the history is because I think it does speak to this stuff. And like, you take the World War II case, right? The Germans basically have all of Europe under occupation and get like, I used to hold up the map, the line they get to in class, like into the Soviet, like the territory they occupy in the Soviet Union by late 1941 is astronomical.
Yeah, they're the gates of Moscow. Like,
Yeah, but like, here's the thing, right? Like, and yes, as Brands points out, the Russians or the Soviets had help from US Lend-Lease aid, which made a difference. When that offensive doesn't get through, like my understanding, and I can get again point the Adam Two's Wages of Destruction book that I've talked about. Like, my view is like they're not going to get it done. Now, like maybe they don't have their entire empire rolled up like they ultimately do, but like the evidence Two's present shows it's got to be a blitzkrieg war, like, or the Germans can't get it done. And ultimately, they run into this enormous grand alliance, this like unbelievable, overwhelming counterbalancing coalition, which really disposes of them in pretty short order. It takes time for the US to mobilize, but the war's over in Europe in about 3.5 years, and that's for an unconditional surrender. So it's like, how close were they really to dominating this whole region? You could make a case. I would say that they were definitely uncomfortably close, but especially in a day and age, as you said, where we have nuclear weapons now, it's at least unclear to me that this could happen in the sort of way he describes. Now, maybe you have a situation where US officials were worried about during the early Cold War, where you get vassal states, or states so economically dependent on Beijing that they largely surrender their state sovereignty, or they Finlandize them, right? Like, these are plausible concerns. I'm not sure I think the threat is as dire right now, but again, to his point, this stuff is contingent.
Yeah, it's contingent. And like, I think to Brand's credit, he also raises the point, just asking the question, what kind of world do you want to live in? It's like, okay, do we have to go stop this from happening again? Do we have to have a world spanning empire and fight a second Cold War against China? China is like a better version of the USSR in every way, shape, and form. Basically, it's going to be way harder. We might not win this one, honestly. Yeah. But he's like, we got to do it, because if we don't do it now, we're going to have to do it later. And living in a world that is split up into hostile armed camps kind of sucks. George Orwell wrote about it, right? It didn't seem that great. 1984.
Yeah, but here's the thing though. So like, wasn't that the Cold War? And he describes that as the golden age, right?
Fair point. That's a fair point. I tend to think that if the US leaves Eurasia completely, Russia and China might be able to make some gains. China might be able to take Taiwan. That's not even clear to me, because Japan is not nothing. South Korea is not nothing.
Plus, it's an amphibious attack, right?
Yeah, not easy. This is a minority viewpoint. I think that Europe, if left to its own devices, will coalesce in a real way and turn it to an actual power. It'll take a while, but like, that's what I think would happen sooner or later. It certainly doesn't have to happen. But Russia against the united Europe, it's like, I'm not going to take Russia in that fight, right? A united, rearmed Europe, that's scary. Nobody should want that, including the United States, by the way. So
a united, rearmed Europe?
Yeah.
Hasn't that been what the United States has always wanted, though?
That's a complicated topic for another time, right? They say they want that, but their policy is not consistent with it, right?
Okay. Yeah. I'm not so sure, and especially this administration, I'm kind of convinced that they probably do want that. There certainly have been times, Eisenhower, obviously, as case in point. I guess I'll leave it at this, since we're running out of time. I don't think we can adjudicate during this podcast, like, which of these grand strategies makes the most sense, or how expensive Chinese foreign policy goals are. I am persuaded that the United States needs to take China's rise very seriously, and that probably more resources should go to that theater. I am less persuaded that the United States needs to be everywhere at this point. And to some extent, that does seem like what he's calling for. And I do think that risks overextension, and that the US has been overextended for most of the post-Cold War period.
It's not clear to me that the US can do it.
Well, so there's that,
stop, right?
But it's also like, if you look at, again, this is where I kind of part ways with him on the post-Cold War stuff. Like, the US has been doing this, and the outcome, I would argue, has been not good.
The outcome is we don't want to do this anymore.
And I think it's worth the settlement with the Soviets in the 1960s, right? It's not like it leads to disarmament on both sides, right? Like, both sides are still very vigilant militarily, and they're still jockeying position with allies and whatnot. But the fundamental source of political tension has been removed. I don't know if there's a deal out there that takes care of this with Taiwan right now. I kind of don't think there is, but it's worth looking to see. if you can reach some sort of settlement rather than having another epic half-century long death struggle that potentially leads to World War III, right? Like,
Brands also wrote a book called The Twilight Struggle, right?
yeah,
Which I haven't read, but that's an awesome name for a book and for the Cold War, if you ask me.
yeah.
Cool. Well, this I think was a really fun thing to do, fun book to read, and great discussion. So
We'll pat ourselves on the back.
yeah, okay, awesome. We should do this more often. Until next time, this has been Global Tantrum. Thanks, Gillen.
Thanks, Steve.